Hello and welcome. I want to give a brief recap of some of the fundamental distinctions that anthropologists have made when trying to figure out how to understand others. The big issue that we're dealing with is how can we understand people from another culture? How can we understand their minds and their psychology? If you think this is something that only psychologists have worried about, this is actually one of the big issues around consciousness. And the philosopher Thomas Nagel, he wrote a very famous essay in the 70s about what is it like to be a bat. And just imagine, as I put here a quote from the paper, being a bat is actually a real challenge for us to imagine what it would be like. Uh, Imagine that you have webbings on one's arms, so you can fly around and you live off insects, but at the same time you can't see properly. And the only way that you really can make sense of your surroundings is through, echolocation, so system of reflected high frequency sound signals. And then, as if this was not enough, you hang upside down most of the day. And the real issue that he was struggling with is, like how can we try and make sense of the subjective feeling of a bat? What would it be like for a bat to be a bat, right? And this is also something that people in psychology have worried about and tried to get to terms with. It's a very old distinction coming from anthropology, which draws upon some principles from linguistics, etic and amic. This was initially termed by Pike, an American researcher who took the idea from linguistics, differentiating between sounds that are common to most languages and sounds that are unique to specific languages. And John Barry, pictured here, a Canadian psychologist, he then transferred these ideas into psychology and popularized that distinction with a couple of additional nuances. And let's go through them. The simplified version by Barry is the distinction between etic versus amic taps onto a number of other dichotomies, right? So etic, we assume that there's one system, versus amic, there are many diverse systems. In etic, units of analysis and theory are known. In amic, we have to discover what is happening within a culture. In etic, we create distinctions. In amic research, we try and discover fundamental principles. Etic is typically associated with an external view and amic with an internal view of a culture. So we have an external versus internal plan. For etic research, we typically have absolute criteria that allow us to map cultures and individuals and thought systems onto absolute standards. For amic research, we typically assume that there are relative criteria that cannot be applied outside the specific system. For etic perspectives, we typically look at non-integration. So we don't try and integrate all the diverse parts of a cultural system, versus amic research, which typically tries to understand a culture in depth in itself, integrating all parts. For amic perspectives, we typically don't need access to all the data. All we need is partial data that can be mapped across a number of different systems. And for amic research, what we typically need is a full understanding of all the different components of a cultural system. So these are the kind of big major distinctions in terms of etic and amic that Barry put into psychological terminology. So if you think about this is actually a fundamental issue whenever you do work across cultural boundaries. You grow up in a specific cultural context, so you're well familiar with all the norms, values, beliefs, the language, so you have an emic understanding of your culture of upbringing. as you cross cultural boundaries now, and you start working and living with another group of individuals that have a different cultural understanding of the world, what you do now is you bring your amic understanding of your home culture and you impose it, this perspective, this interpretation, onto what you see in the new culture. So what happens here is you impose an etic view that is guided, influenced, and shaped by your amic perspective based on your own upbringing. Right? So as we move across cultures, pretty much all of us, we will move from an amic understanding of our own culture to an imposed ethics outsider perspective of the host culture. As you spend time in your host culture, and start to understand the values, norms, beliefs, language, etc., you start to understand that system from within, and you start to develop what is called a new amic understanding. So what happens now is we have potentially researcher, could be you, could be somebody else, who now has two amic understandings: amic understanding of their home culture and an amic in-depth understanding of their host culture. And now what we could ask as psychologists is, how similar or different are these two amic systems? Right? So can they be compared with each other? What are the similarities? What are the differences? And what Barry argued is, if there are concepts, if there are worldviews, values, norms that are compatible between amic 1 and amic 2, so this is the shared overlapping part here, what we have is, in this particular case, it's a derived ethic, because it applies to both cultural systems. It can be directly compared, and so therefore it is an ethic view, but it is a derived ethic because it is based on careful amic research, careful amic understanding of the two cultural contexts. On the other hand, if these components are not really comparable with each other, we continue with an amic 1 and an amic 2, and so we can't make direct links or comparisons between these two groups. Right? So essentially what Barry did is he added to the emic-etic argument, he added the idea of an imposed ethic and a derived ethic, which is driven by in-depth cultural research that helps people to understand what is common and what is distinct between cultural systems, to then make some claims about, universality, which becomes this kind of derived ethic. So now, if we look at the schema that he put in his presentation, this is pretty much a 5-step waltz here. Beginning research in your own culture with amic A, moving to a new culture, so transporting this amic perspective to a new cultural context becomes imposed ethic. As you uncover the cultural components, you start to develop an amic understanding of the new culture, and then this allows you to compare the two cultures. If the comparison is not possible, as we've seen before, we have two amics. If there are comparisons that can be made because there's some overlap, we have a potential derived ethic. So now, how does that map onto our main paradigms within psychology and culture? In cross-cultural psychology, we are typically concerned with comparisons between groups. And the question for us then will become, can we make these kind of comparisons? If we can make them, so we can make judgments in terms of derived ethics, then hooray, we can make some claims about similarity or differences between populations. If the psychological concepts are not comparable, then obviously we can't do anything with those concepts from a cross-cultural perspective. Right? So this is really the domain of cross-cultural psychology. right? Trying to compare cultural systems across different populations. Cultural psychology, on the other hand, is really an in-depth understanding of the amic concepts. So how can we understand how cultural systems work in their entirety, how they are structured, how they develop, and questions like this. So this is a very in-depth understanding of typically a single cultural group or a small number of cultural groups. And then of course we have indigenous psychologies. And indigenous psychologies most of the time are concerned with a very in-depth understanding of groups on their own terms. So there are variations of indigenous psychologies around the world, but typically what they are concerned with is a description of their cultural system, norms, values, beliefs, health models based on their own terms. Right? So this is how these three different perspectives within psychology and culture map onto that framework by Mary. And so there are a couple of questions that you can ask yourself, and these are discussion questions, right? And the first one is really thinking about what I just told you about in terms of etic versus amic. One of the big questions is, would you be able to conduct an experimental amic study? Is that possible or not? Our anthropology friends often would argue that amic research is an in-depth qualitative understanding of a cultural system. But as a psychologist, one of the big questions is, could we use experiments? If you think it is possible, try and give an example of how you could conduct an amic experimental study. If no, maybe provide some arguments why it is not possible to use experiments. And a second question that I think would be very useful as a discussion point is, can a qualitative study be following a postattic perspective? Again, this is something that would be great if you think about the underlying assumptions of qualitative research and how that may or may not fit in with culture and psychology, and then try and explain your answers.